Hello and welcome back to the Ground Up Advanced Flight Tutorials. Thank you very much for joining me in this episode, and today we are going to be learning about crosswind takeoffs, general crosswind flying and crosswind landings. Before we do so, if you haven't watched my previous videos, I highly recommend you go watch episodes 3, 4, 5 and 7, as we will be using all the things that we learnt in those episodes we're going to be using today in this episode. So that is the takeoff, climbing out, turning the aircraft, flying a circuit, and then landing an aircraft. So we're going to be using all of that today, and with an ILS system. Although we might not use it too much, but it's still going to be there. So I do want you guys to go back and watch, or get a refresher if you've forgotten, lessons 3, 4, 5 and 7. Is it 3, 4, 5 and 7? 3, 4, 5 and 7. Yep, that's right. So do go check those out. Also, don't forget that if you do like these videos and those other videos, please do like the videos with a thumbs up, or hitting that like button, subscribing to the channel, leaving comments, telling me what you want to see, any questions you may have that I might be able to answer. And also, if you can, please do support me on Patreon. Link to that is in the description box below. Your support would be massively appreciated. It would help me out a huge amount. Plus you get access to my Discord server, which will allow you to talk to me a lot more, and there's a nice small growing community there as well, so you can talk about all sorts of stuff, and I will be revealing anything that I plan to do there first, and everything basically goes on that server. There's a lot that goes on that server. And if you do go for tier 2, you'll get access to the Flight Sim Tutorials channel on there as well, where you can ask me all sorts of flight sim questions, or all sorts of engineering questions or flight questions, and I will be more than happy to answer all of them. Anyway, with that out the way, first thing I'm going to do is make sure the flaps are down, ready for takeoff, and we are going to do a little bit of theory on the ground before taking to the skies in a very interesting fashion, because I have set up a pretty stiff crosswind over here, or just a pretty stiff wind over here. Where am I? I am at Echo Golf November X-Ray, that's East Midlands Airport, just as we have been for, what, 7 of the 9 episodes so far? Or 8 of the 9 episodes so far? No, it would be for 8 of the 9 episodes so far we have been at this airport. And so we're here again, but this time we are on runway 27 as opposed to runway 09. The reason is going to become very clear in a moment. I'm going to now tune ATIS, that's Air Traffic Information System, for East Midlands Airport, which is on 128.225. so I'm going to tune that, and we are going to take some information out of it, not everything, only some information. As a matter of fact, only one piece of information. So let's go ahead and do that. There it is. Let's actually bring it out on the speaker, so we can actually hear it. Although it's not. Hold on, I'll come back to that. Yeah, it'll come up in a moment. But anyway, there's the information at the top, so you can see 1140 Zulu. We don't have to worry about that. That one that just went out, 212 at 16. That's what we need to know. And as you can see, ILS runway 27 in use, and landing and departing runway 27. That's exactly why we are on 27. So we'll bring that up again. It'll go through again. Hopefully this time there'll be someone speaking. Or not. Is it on the phone? Or possibly because it should be on Com 1. That would have helped. No, I can't hear it today. Anyway, 212 at 16. That's the one we're really looking for today. Wind 212 at 16. So we'll just get rid of that. And so, what does 212 at 16 mean? Well, if we have a look at our compass card here, you can see we've got our standard. We all know how this compass card works. If you don't, please do go check out lesson number 1. And that will actually teach you what this compass card does and how it works. So 212 on this compass card is right past that number 21. So 212 is just past that thicker line, that longer line, just there. That's going to be 212, between that and that 215, which is a thinner line. So that's 212. So what does that mean? That means that there is a wind blowing at 16 knots from that direction towards the aircraft. So you're probably going to say, well, what does that have to do with an aircraft? What does wind have to do with an aircraft, and how does it affect an aircraft? What effect does it have on an aircraft? And that's exactly what I'm going to be explaining. Before we look at this 212 at 16, we're going to imagine that there is a wind blowing 180 at 10. That's what we're going to imagine right now, 180 at 10. And we are going to also imagine that we are flying 270 at 100 knots. So we're going to pretend that we are at 100 knots flying a heading of 270 with a wind of 10 knots at 180, blowing 180. So what that means, when it says 180 at 10, that means that it's coming from the direction of 180. So that means it's blowing, in this case, north. That's what it means. It's where the wind is coming from, not where it's blowing to. So it's not blowing south, it's not blowing towards 180, it's blowing from 180. So that means it's a northerly wind. Anyway, let's go back to this. So if we were doing 100 knots, flying 270, so flying due west, in 1 hour we are going to fly 100 nautical miles. That's how it works. So in 1 hour, 1 knot is 1 nautical mile an hour. I explained this in lesson number 1. 1 knot, 1 nautical mile an hour, which means that in 1 hour we will do 100 nautical miles at 100 knots. That is in no wind. So that means also across the ground we're going to do 100 nautical miles. We're not going to be talking too much about ground airspeed and true airspeed and all of that today. That's going to come in later. It'll come in naturally to what we do. But today we're just looking at speed in general. Now, if we were flying at 100 knots and there's an airport exactly due west of us, 100 miles, it's going to take us 1 hour to get there. But what if there is that wind blowing, the one that I said, 180 at 10? Well, for this, what I want you guys to do is I want you guys to grab a piece of paper and we're going to draw a bit of a triangle. What we're going to do is at the bottom corner, or wherever you want to draw it, on your piece of paper, I'd probably recommend starting somewhere where you can draw a triangle that's going to go upwards and a little bit across. So we're looking at a right angle triangle that's going to be quite tall, and then a little bit, it's going to have a little bit of width to it. So just bear that in mind when you're actually drawing it on your piece of paper. So the bottom corner is going to be the aircraft. So if you want, you can draw a little aircraft like this over there. In that direction, or a little stick aircraft, or just a dot, a little circle. That is going to be your aircraft. We are now going to draw maybe 10 centimeters or 10 inches or 10 arbitrary units. Don't do 10 millimeters, that's going to be a little bit small. Maybe some sort of 10 arbitrary units. We're going to draw 10 arbitrary units straight up on your piece of paper. So if you draw 10 arbitrary units straight up, that is your 100 knots. And that is the distance you have traveled doing 100 knots. So the top point now of this line is where you are going if you are facing due west and there is no wind. What I now want you to do is, from that top line, we're going to draw a perpendicular line, so a complete right angle, and we're going to draw a line that is 1/10 of the size. So 100 knots to 10 knots. So 100 knots was the direction we're going. 10 knots is our crosswind. So if you did a 10 centimeter line, I want you to draw a 1 centimeter line that goes perpendicular to that 10 centimeter line from that top corner. Essentially, we're starting to draw a triangle here. What I now want you to do is then connect the edge of that line, so that the final point of that line, all the way down back to the bottom, to complete the triangle, to complete your right angle triangle. So now you have a right angle triangle that goes up 10 units, goes across 1 unit, and then a diagonal line that comes back down right to the bottom. That's your right angle triangle. What is this right angle triangle telling us? Well, what it's telling us is that if the nose of the aircraft, or the thrust of the aircraft, is pointed in the direction that we've got the long line on, that 100 knot line, that is where the aircraft is going to fly in no wind. However, if there is a 10 knot crosswind and we are doing 100 knots, the point at the end of the crosswind component, so if you follow the line up and then across to where the diagonal line starts, that point there is where the aircraft is going to end up if the nose is still pointed in that direction. Does it sound a little bit confusing? Let me explain it in another way. Imagine you are walking in one direction. So you are walking straight down a road or something, but there is a really strange conveyor belt system on the road. For some reason, you know, maybe it's a bit of a challenge. You know, you may be in a room or something like that, and the ground has this challenge. The conveyor system is pushing in a perpendicular direction to where you're walking. So you're walking towards one wall, and the conveyor belt system is directly 90 degrees, is pushing directly 90 degrees in another direction. Now, if you continue to walk straight towards the opposite wall where maybe there's a door, and this belt is pushing you in a certain direction, let's say 10 times slower than the speed you're walking. So let's say you're walking at 5 miles an hour and it is pushing you at half a mile an hour, then you are going to move in, let's say it takes you I don't know, let's just say it takes a minute to get across the room. In that minute, you are not going to be in front of that door anymore, because that conveyor belt will have pushed you further towards one side or the other, whichever way you're imagining your conveyor belt. So what would you do? Naturally, the human body, what will you do? You actually adjust the way you're walking very naturally, because you see that you are being pushed to one side, and you compensate by turning the direction of your walking, so turning the direction of the force that you're applying, your thrust forward. You are changing your direction into the push. So if the conveyor is pushing you from, let's say, left to right, you naturally turn your body to push more towards the left. So you start putting more force towards the left in order to reach your destination where you need to go. You do this actually out on the road when you're in a, you know, if it's a really windy day and you are being pushed around in one direction, you naturally adjust the way you are walking to push into the wind so that you can continue maintaining your straight line. And that is exactly what we are going to have to do here. So with the example of the 270 and the 180, the way we need to work it out is the angle at the bottom is going to be the angle that we need to push the nose of the aeroplane into the wind. So very simply, to work it out, we're doing 100 knots and we've got a 10 knot crosswind. The one that we need to use, the trigonometry we need to use, we're going to be using tan. So we do have to do a bit of trigonometry here, and we've got the opposite. So if you think of the angle, where we have the angle, the opposite is the crosswind component because it's directly opposite the angle. The hypotenuse is the long line, which is the diagonal line, and the adjacent is the other straight line. So we want to do the opposite over the adjacent first. So what we're going to do is we're going to go 10 divided by 100. Very simple, 1/10. So then we've got 0.1, and then we need to do the inverse tan or the arctan of 0.1. So if we do the arctan of 0.1, you might need a calculator for this. In fact, you probably will need a calculator for this because it's not a well-known number. We are getting 5.7 degrees approximately. So what does that mean? What does 5.7 degrees mean? That means that the nose of the aircraft, to make sure that you still manage to fly due west and get to your destination, to keep the aircraft in a straight line, the direction you want it to go, you need to adjust the heading of the aircraft 5.7 degrees into the wind, which means the aircraft actually needs to be pointing at a heading of, what is it, 264.3? 264.3 degrees. So let's say 264 degrees or 265 degrees. So that aircraft needs to deflect and fly in at a heading of 264 degrees for it to be able to maintain a track. So a track is the actual way it's flying, of 270 degrees. That's called crabbing. The aircraft is crabbing in the air. Why is it called crabbing? If you've ever seen a crab walk on a beach, you'll know. Crabs walk sideways. So what a crab is doing is saying, I want to go in that direction, and I'm going to crawl along essentially sideways. That's what you're doing with the aircraft. You're partially turning the aircraft so it flies sideways. You may have seen crosswinds in aircraft in the air on a windy day. You'll see that they are clearly not facing the direction they are actually flying, and this happens in the air. An aircraft could be doing 400, let's say 350 knots. An aircraft is doing 350 knots, but it could have a crosswind of 45 knots. So if it's got a 45 knot crosswind, so you do the same thing, 45 divided by 350, and then you do the arctan of that, and you'll see that that is 7.3 degrees. I've got a calculator here, I'm not doing that in my head. I'm not that good with trigonometry. 7.3 degrees. So an aircraft doing 350 knots could be at 30,000 feet. If it wants to go on a heading of 270, it would be doing a heading, it would actually be flying a heading of 263 or 262 point something, 262.5 or whatever. About 262.5 is probably what it would be flying, so that it maintains a 270 track. This is very important for flying, especially if you're trying to get to a VOR or even trying to get to an airport. So what else do we need to know? Well, we've just given an example where it's 90 degrees, a direct crosswind. Now, before we get into the air, which I know we've been on the ground for quite a while here, I might even split this into two parts. In fact, I probably will split this into two parts. So what we're going to do is we're going to first calculate what we need to know over here. So we're going to do this in this part, and then we'll end this part and then go on to the next one, which is where we'll get into the air. So we need to work out a crosswind component and a head or tailwind component. Now the head or tailwind component is not going to be effective quite just yet, because we're not going to have to use it right now for various reasons, but it is going to be when we try and perhaps land the aircraft. We may need to know of this. By the way, another bit of information: aircraft always fly and land into the wind, which is why we're on runway 27. We're about to work it out in a moment, and you'll see why we're set up on runway 27 as opposed to 09. So 212 at 16, how are we going to do that? Well, same way as we worked out the aircraft flying in which direction, how far across it's going to go. Right now we have the actual wind component. So we can draw a diagonal line on a piece of paper again, a diagonal line which is going to be part of a right angle triangle. So we'll draw the diagonal line and then we'll connect it up to give ourselves a nice right angle triangle. So I want to do the triangle. It's going to be, if you watch my mouse, it's going to go down like that, and then like that, and then like that. So essentially working along this thing here. So 180, 270, across there, and then back down. You see that? Got it? Fantastic. Right. So now we need to work out how is that going to help us calculate the crosswind component and the head/tailwind component. Well, very simply, we've got that. That is 16. We've already got that because that is the speed. So that is 16 knots. Fantastic. And we've got the angle. It's 212. So what we can do is we either take 180, which is our flat in this case, and bring it up to 212, which is going to give us 32 degrees. Or we can take 270 over here, and we can take away from that to 212, which is going to give us 58 degrees, which is actually going to be exactly the same as the angle from the top of the triangle to the start of the wind vector. So that's a Z angle there. That's mathematics. That angle is the exact same as that angle, but we can work that out. So what we've got is we've got 58 degrees. We've got, what was the other one I said it was? 32 degrees. And then we've got 90 degrees. So angles in a triangle add up to 180. That adds up to 180. So what we can do is we can use some more trigonometry to work out the crosswind component and the headwind component. The way we're going to do it is very, very simple. We can say, well, we've got the hypotenuse. So that means the only identities that work is sine and cosine for this, because tan doesn't, there's nothing you can work out with the hypotenuse from tan, going back to secondary school or middle school if you're in America, or maybe high school mathematics here. So we've got SOH, so, ka, toa, and we can use so and ka. So we can use that. So we've got SOH. What information do we have? We have the hypotenuse and we have the sine of the angle, which means we can work out the opposite very, very easily. So the sine we've got is, let's use that one down there. So that was 32. So we've got 32 degrees multiplied by, so we've got the sine of 32 degrees, which is almost a half. So we could say it's a half here. So it's almost a half multiplied by the vector, which was 16, the hypotenuse, and that's going to give us, like we said, almost a half. So we can approximate it to be approximately 8. I think the actual number is 8.5, but we could say 8 or 8.5. So if you are approximating this in your head, you would say, oh well, it's that, and then it's that. That's a distance of 32 degrees. Let's say 30 degrees. So we're going to say it's 8. So you've got that in your head. Obviously, you're not going to have a calculator in your aircraft all the time. So we're going to go, right, 8 knots is our headwind, because it's blowing from this direction down. So we're saying what is the component that is blowing from 270 essentially. So that is 8 knots blowing directly into the face of the aircraft. Now that means that your ground speed is going to be 8 knots slower than your indicated airspeed. So if you are doing 100 knots, you are actually doing 92 knots. 92 knots over the ground. So this is something to take into account, perhaps whilst you're landing, because if you're landing and you want to land at 80 knots, you're actually landing at 72 knots. As you get closer to the ground, you're actually doing 72 knots because the wind is pushing back, which means that you want to be going a little bit faster as you try and land an aircraft, which for today or in the next lesson you're going to see it's going to be a little bit faster once we get to the landing section. So we've done that. We know that's going to be 8.5 knots is the headwind. Right, so we can make a note of that, 8.5 knots. For the crosswind, we can do something very similar. As a matter of fact, we can say, well, look, we've got the cosine here, so we can use we've got the adjacent, and we've got the hypotenuse, and we've got the cos. So we can say, well, what's the cosine of this? So we can say cosine of 32, which is actually very close to, I think the identity is root 3 over 2, but root 3 over 2 isn't really going to help here. So we can say what's the cosine of 32 is 0.84, and then we can multiply that by 16, and we'll see that it's about 0.8 of what we have, which means that we've got a crosswind of 13.5 knots. 13.5 knots is our crosswind component. That's a pretty heavy crosswind. So blowing from the 180 direction, it's 13.5. Blowing from the 270 direction, it's 8.5 knots. So 13.5 and 8.5 knots. And if you do want to double check that, you can use Pythagoras. A squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. A squared is 13.5 knots, b squared is 8.5 knots, square the two, add them together, and then do the square root of that, and you should get 16 knots. So that's just something if you want to double check. Now, whilst you're flying in the air, how is this actually going to help you? You can't get a calculator out, so what you can do is you can use a rule of sixths. So what does a rule of sixth mean? Well, as it states, you can use every 10 degrees of your relative wind angle, you can approximate to be 1/6, and then 1/6 allows you to get an easy sine of these figures, and then from there you can go ahead and multiply by that 1/6 sort of angle. So you can say, okay, if let's see, what's the easiest way to explain? Yeah, here's an easy way to explain. I did this again, so let's do this again using the angle, the 1/6 rule. So we said it's 32 degrees. Remember that angle? We said it's 32 degrees blowing at 16. Now if we use a 1/6 rule and we say it's 30 degrees, we'll approximate to 30 degrees, we can say what's 1/6, or so 30 degrees is going to be 3/6, 10 degrees is 1/6, 20 is 2/6, 30 is 3/6, 40 is 4, 50 is 5, 60 through 90 is 6/6. So that's how we're going to do that. Now unfortunately the error also starts to increase at this point, so we're going to talk about the errors as well. But anyway, 30 is 3/6. That means that your error, because 3/6 is 0.5, but sine of 30 is also 0.5, your error is going to be 0. So that's actually the most accurate. We've managed to get a fairly accurate one over here. So we do 30, which is 3/6. So we get 16 multiplied by 3/6, which is 0.5, and you get 8. That's almost similar to what we had. 8.5 is the actual figure, but that's because it was 32 degrees. But if it was 30, you'd have the exact same one. Now to take the other one into account. So the other angle was what? 58 degrees? So the other one was 58 degrees. Now 58 degrees is fairly close to 60 degrees, so we can use 6/6, which is actually 1. Now 16 multiplied by 1 is 16. Now we know that we worked it out to be 13.5, so obviously something's gone wrong here. Well, at this point we don't use the rule of 6, at least for 60 degrees. The reason being is that that's the most error you can get on the rule of 6. So what we're going to do is we actually use 0.9 instead. So we multiply it by about 0.9. So what you can do is very easily is, if you're doing it in your head, obviously you're trying to fly an aircraft here, you say, well, 16 divided by 10 is 1.6. 1.6 multiplied by, well, you can say, you can split it up if you want. You can do 0.6 multiplied by 9, which is going to be what, 50, so it's going to be 5.4. So you can say, well, that's 5.4, and then you can say, what is what's the other one we've got? Yeah, so then we've got 1 multiplied by 9, so that's going to be 9. So then we can just do 9 plus 5.4 is equal to 14.4. 14.4 and 13.5, we're only out by 1 knot of wind, and this time we can work it out in our heads. That's the rule of 6. Again, to go over it one more time, 10 degrees relative wind angle is going to be 1/6, 20 is 2/6, 30 is 3, 40 is 4, 50 is 5, 60 is 0.9. Don't use 6/6 because the error is 13%. 70 is 6/6, 80 is 6/6, and 90 is 6/6. At 90 and 30, the error is 0. As you can imagine, because at 30, it's exactly 0.5, and at 90, it's exactly 1. At 80, it's a 2% error, so that's okay. What I don't like particularly is 70, 60, and 50. 60 is the worst, 50 is 7% error, and 70 is about a 6% error. So I don't like them personally, but you know, you've got to do what you've got to do. And that's unfortunately how we've got to fly. So you can work this out all in your head. So we've done that now. Now we can work out the crosswind components and the headwind component. We know what crosswinds are, we know what headwinds are, we know what tailwinds are, we know why we've got the runway selected as we have, because we fly into a headwind, always taking off and landing into a headwind. And we know we've done all our calculations, and we know what a crosswind does to affect an aircraft. So if you were flying in one direction and there was crosswind blowing, you would be blown off course, and now you know how to work that out by using tan. And like I said, you can use sine and cos to work out relative crosswind and headwind angles, or you can guess it using the rule of 6. That's where I'm going to end this episode. In the next video, we're going to actually be putting all of this into practical use, which means taking off and looking at takeoff procedures in a crosswind, which is very different to a normal takeoff procedure. We're going to be doing a circuit around this airport, and then we're going to be landing the aircraft, and I'm going to be talking about 2 different ways to land an aircraft in a crosswind, and then demonstrating one of them, possibly, maybe, I don't know, I might demonstrate both of them. If not, we'll be demonstrating the other when we do another flight, another cross-country flight, which we'll be following the next episode. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button if you like the video. Subscribe to the channel for more videos on the ground up advanced flight tutorials. Leave a comment in the comments box below. I know all this crosswind, it was a lot of maths today, but we're going to put this all into practical use in the next episode, so make sure you stay tuned for that. And last but not least, please do support me on Patreon. Link to that is in the description box below. I would massively appreciate your support. It would help me out a huge amount, and as you can see, it does take a lot to plan these videos, so your support would be massively appreciated. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next episode of the Ground Up Advanced Flight Tutorials.